As Ryan said, the obligatory introduction, I'm the director of web engineering out at MindGrub Technologies, headquartered in Baltimore. I do a lot of development work, WordPress, Drupal, Node.js. I also got tasked with running a team to build a robot, so while not confined to this talk, find me afterwards. I'd love to talk about robotics with people. It's really cool. Been working with web tech since roughly 2006, depending on how you count. You can find me on Twitter. I normally tweet about various things as I go along. I'm a baker, I'm an outdoorsman, I'm a tech nerd. I go outdoors to get away from the technology. I try and go outdoors where there's no cell coverage, where there's no Wi-Fi, so that nobody can find me, so that when I'm not developing, I'm out and about. I also have to share, this is my very first WordPress event. So I'm very grateful to all of you for inviting me so that I can be here with all of you and share this knowledge. Over the past couple of years, it's been doing web development, we've encountered a bit of a problem with some of the sites that we've worked on. We've got our e-commerce website. We sell fantastic colanders to people, the very best colanders you could ever find. We have some that are small, some that are tall. Regardless, I've got this great e-commerce website that sells colanders to different people. And you can go online and you can buy them. And then one day, as we go along, Katy Perry, who through my research actually has the most Twitter followers on Twitter, decides to tweet out a link to our colanders for people to go buy them because she has one and she likes it so much in all the cooking that she does that she thinks everybody else should have one. It also gets featured on Dig. How many people still use Dig? Anybody? Couple of hands. How about Reddit? Many more hands, right? All right, so we get featured on Reddit as well, talking about the fantasticness of our colanders for people to go buy them. And that's okay, because it's an e-commerce site. We're fronted by a content delivery network, Amazon, Cloudflare, maybe we're using Fastly or one of the built-in CDNs through Pantheon or Pagely. And so as people visit our website and they try and look at the colanders, that's okay, because all of that traffic is hitting the CDN and we can still serve those pages to them. And even though we have all of those people, millions of them that clicked on the link when Katy Perry tweeted it out, it doesn't matter because that CDN just absorbs all that traffic, which is great until they try and add the product to their shopping cart, which we can't cache with the CDN, and then you end up with a page that looks like this. Developer's worst nightmare, a client's worst nightmare, a manager's worst nightmare as they get the call from the project manager asking why somebody's site is down and not realizing that having a big name celebrity tweet about your site is a good thing. The Shark Tank effect, if you will. And so one of the challenges with these links as people tweet them out or we have celebrities work with them is that it's impossible to scale that quickly. I can't have servers spin up fast enough to handle the load of all these people now hitting my website. And even with the invention of Docker and moving to more of a containerized system and containers can start very quickly, eventually I'm going to exceed the capacity I have to run those containers and handle all of those incoming requests, which means I'm going to lose traffic. People aren't going to be able to add my favorite colanders to their web carts. They're not going to be able to buy them. And now I've violated the golden rule of e-commerce, which is always take the order. And so how can we solve that? One of the great ways to solve it that's kind of new in web technology as we go along is this concept of service workers. How many people have heard of service workers before? It's very good. That's more than I normally get. So service workers are officially called web workers by the W3C, but nobody really likes that name. People always call them service workers. That's what Google has termed them, and therefore it's become the new de facto name. And they're part of these long-running background tasks that you can run in your browser. They're not tied to a particular user request. They're not tied to a page load. They let you run things in the background of the browser as the user is doing other things. Why is this important? Because it's really putting that emphasis on having an app-like experience. Google wants to make it so that with service workers, you can actually take and create what they're calling progressive web applications and install a website on your phone. Think about that for a minute. Not a mobile app that's distributed through the Google Play Store or through the iPhone App Store, but a website that's written in HTML, CSS, WordPress, whatever web technology you would like, installed as a native mobile app on your phone. It's a very, very different experience. And so that's why they're pushing forward these long-running background tasks like you can do if you're writing a true iOS or a Google Android app. Now, while this exists, we're still very early on in the progression of service workers as they go along. Service workers are still coming along. They've been in some browsers for quite some time. They've been in others for less so. But there are a couple of gotchas as you work with them. And so if you look to add service workers to your website, and we'll look at some code in a few minutes here, one of the first things you will learn is that directories are important. How many people include JavaScript files in their custom WordPress themes? Okay. Now, if I'm developing a custom WordPress theme and I want to have service workers as part of that to do this work, then it would stand to reason that I would take and make my service worker.js file, my JavaScript file for my service worker, live within maybe a JS directory within my custom theme or within a JavaScript directory, depending on what naming convention you would like. And while that's great for JavaScript that runs on your page, it's not great for service workers because the service workers are scoped to the directory in which they exist. So if my service worker file lives at wp-content/themes/mycustom-themes/js/serviceworker.js, it will only ever run for requests where the URL is that deep. We're probably not serving content pages with a WP content in the URL. So you have to figure out a way to get them back towards the top level so that they can be scoped accordingly. Maybe you're putting them at a subdirectory and only handling things within that subdirectory, or what a lot of people are doing are putting them at the root level of their WordPress site. One of the other gotchas with service workers is that they only work over HTTPS. Now, there's nothing in the specifications that say they have to work under HTTP or HTTPS. There's no requirement for it. But similar to HTTP2, which browsers are only introducing over an HTTPS secure connection, service workers similarly will only work over HTTPS. Now, for those of us that like to do local development, which is probably a good number of you, that can present some challenges, because not only do you have to use them over HTTPS, your SSL certificate has to be valid. So you can't use a self-signed certificate when you're testing your service workers. Luckily, browsers realized that this was going to be very difficult for local development, and they added an extra domain to the safe domains list that browsers recognize. By default, browsers will recognize any website with a valid SSL certificate as being a safe domain. They will also, very kindly, recognize localhost as a safe domain, even if served under HTTP. Now, many of you probably listened to the security talk yesterday afternoon. Whether you consider your local machine to be safe or not to serve JavaScript files to you, I'll leave that up to you to consider. But for the purposes of service worker development, I generally trust my local host to be safe. The third part about service workers is you kind of have to cross your fingers. Because they're still very early on in the development phase of actually building this functionality into browsers, the error reporting and error handling for these things is not at the level you might expect. It's a background task, so being able to use console.log to debug what's going on, there's no console in a long-running background task that's separate from your web page. In addition to that, if for some reason your service worker just fails to get installed by the browser, it won't really tell you, so you can't get the user to take corrective action to try and give them a better experience, or you can't even do a retry. They're starting to tweak that a little bit, but it's still very much a hit or miss thing as you go along, as you're doing this development. And finally, as I sort of alluded to, you have to hope that your users are using a supported browser. Now, what do I mean by using a supported browser? This is my Steve Jobs moment here as I get to put up the checklist. So if you're using Chrome, if your users are using Chrome, that's fantastic. Google is really pioneering this. Google Chrome has, hands down, the best support for service workers and has for quite some time. Second on that list, Firefox also has had support for service workers for many recent builds since before Firefox 45. A couple of notes there. As I was working on the demo portion of this talk, I discovered that for whatever reason, a configuration setting set in my Firefox browser from some of the development plugins I had disabled service worker support. Which one? I don't know, because they haven't given a way to tell you yet. But Firefox does have support for all of this built in, and in my fresh installs of Firefox without any of my developer tweaks to make my life easier, it did work fully out of the box. Anybody still use Opera? Anybody who looks through Google Analytics find people using Opera? A couple of us? Fantastic. Opera has full support, in case you were wondering. Then we get on to Safari. I gave Safari a check mark. Safari has support for it, but it doesn't have support for everything. It's still coming along, and much of that support is still in the Safari technical preview, which most people probably aren't running if they're just browsing your website generically. So we put a little asterisk with Safari there. It's hopefully catching up soon. When it appeared in the technical preview, again, people got very excited that hopefully Apple was starting to make strides there. And then we get into some of our favorites. Internet Explorer? Nope. Internet Explorer 11 even? No support. Microsoft doesn't say they have plans to support it. Anybody who's using Internet Explorer 11 won't be able to see the benefits of service workers. Now, on the one hand, the good news is that if browsers don't support service workers, they just degrade gracefully, and they don't get that experience. So you don't have to do special coding to opt out your IE 11 users. They just won't get the improved experience that somebody on Chrome or Firefox or Opera might be getting. Good news, Microsoft Edge does have support for it. But I'll asterisk this one again because while Microsoft Edge did build in support for service workers, they put it behind a flag that's disabled by default. So how useful is that really? Hopefully, down the road, they'll switch that flag to default to on. So really, what we're all here for, this is a developer conference. We want to see the code. How do we actually get this onto our website so that we can solve this add to shopping cart problem or solve the other problems with it? On this screen here, this is all you need to do to add a service worker to your website. It's maybe a dozen lines of code, if that. At the top there, we just look to see if the service worker exists in Navigator. If we do, we try and register a service worker. In this case, my service worker file is sw.js. One note, this file here is called sw.js. So you're registering the file that's running the code. And then we listen for the install event for when the browser fires it. And in this case, we start to add a bunch of files that are stored in the pre-cache files variable to a list of caches. Now what that will do is it will cause the user's browser to go out and try and retrieve any of those files in that pre-cache files array and store a local copy of them on the user's computer. We talked yesterday some about local browser storage. Some of the conversations I've been part of around the LoopConf here have been about how do we use local browser storage to try and enhance our caching in addition to the server-side caching that we learned about yesterday. I'm not a huge fan of local browser storage and local browser caching through that because it requires a lot of work. I have to write a lot of JavaScript to be able to intelligently put data into that and pull data out. The caching that we're doing here, this pre-cache files through the service worker, is very similar to adding a full page cache to the front of your website. So it's just going to cache the full HTML page in the same way that a CDN or Varnish might do that. Now, if you want to get kind of fancy, you could add a little bit more code to all of this. This here listens for the fetch event. Your browser fires off the fetch event anytime it tries to make a network request. What this service worker code here is doing is actually intercepting that fetch request. From that, we can take full control of what the request actually is going to be, and rather than make that network request, we can first look and see if we have that file cached locally and serve it back to the user without ever incurring the network latency of starting a connection, waiting for a server to respond, and sending it back. Even with a content delivery network, you're talking about maybe 18 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds if you're on a super good connection on the user side and a super great Wi-Fi connection or bandwidth to that CDN edge node. This, we eliminate all of that. It just gets served from the local computer. No need for that. It also, when the user requests it, will make that request in the background to refresh the cache. So you don't have to worry about cache invalidation or doing all of that. It will serve the user the cached page it has locally and then refresh that cache in the background. And there's a bit more code, not in this presentation here, but I'll share after the presentation, that allows the user to then see that updated content. So you could display something like a loading indicator or a snippet of the old content and then refresh it for the user once they've downloaded that to give them a smoother experience. Now, in the back of the room here is Joel. Wednesday night, all of the speakers had a tech rehearsal. And during the tech rehearsal, I plugged my slides in, and Joel said, "Are you going to do a demo?" And I said, "Yeah, probably not. I'll just do screenshots within the presentation here." He's like, "Great. Don't leave the presentation, whatever you do." Then I put a demo slide in my content. But how many people like magic? Magic tricks? Anybody? So there's this great quote from Sean Farquhar. I highly recommend, if you enjoy magic and you haven't seen him, go out to Google or YouTube after the camp here and do a YouTube search for Sean Farquhar, Penn and Teller Fool Us. He has a fantastic magic trick. It's 7.5, 8 minutes long. You will definitely be impressed. But during it, he said this quote: "Magic that takes place in the spectator's hands is so much more powerful." And so in order to keep my word to Joel that I wouldn't leave the keynote presentation, and in order to impress all of you, we'll now do the live demo in your hands. So for those of you that have computers, this is your opportunity to leverage them. First thing we want to do is go ahead and open up the Chrome browser. This will give you the best experience, the most luck with the magic trick here as you go along. Go ahead and pause Slack for just a moment. You're talking with a couple of coworkers. Tell them you're about to see something amazing. They'll have to wait. I promise it'll be worth your time. Once you have Chrome open, I want you to pull up my sample WordPress website. It's live-wpserviceworkers.pantheonsite.io, or if that's too much to type, I also bit.ly the link here over on the side. You'll know you're there when you see the default WordPress install, giving you that fantastic picture of the tabletop, a couple of blurred windows in the background. Everybody with me so far? It's okay, because I've got a whole room full of people visiting my free Pantheon site, but they've got the CDN caching it, so you guys didn't take the site down, hopefully. These are all screenshots, so I assume it's still working. Now, once you've gone ahead and loaded that page up, I want you, to the end of it, to go to /slow.php. This is when I perform a distributed denial of service attack against my web host. This page, slow.php, interestingly enough, based on our last talk, runs a loop that starts at a count of 0 and counts up to 999,999,999. And if that wasn't bad enough, I threw a second loop inside of it that also did the same thing. So we count to close to 1 billion, and then we do it again for 1 billion times. As you go along, you'll see this simulates somebody tweeting out a link and everybody hitting the Add to Cart button simultaneously, because we've now exceeded the resources of my free Pantheon site. And you guys probably got a page that looks like this, that tells you the page could not be loaded. Now, anytime a client sends me a picture of this screenshot, my heart sinks, because not only are they upset that their site is down, they're also upset that it doesn't have any of their branding on it. It's the small things. So once you've gotten that slow page to load and it tells you it actually can't be loaded, and in fact, in my testing, I've never gotten it to count to 1 billion times within the timeout limits that are set, go ahead and throw a $help on the end of that URL. And once you do that, you should see that it loads up a page right away that tells you this is a slow loading page. We just intercepted that networking request and gave the user a better experience while we loaded that page in the background. Now, in this case, that page will never load. We all know that. We all accept that. But if this were a long-running system that had to connect out to a third party to get data back to show that to them that we couldn't cache, rather than having the user sit there with their browser spinning, instead we gave them a better experience. Looks something like this. Now, this next step is going to be a little difficult for all of you, but we had some practice earlier today. I want you to go ahead and disconnect from the Wi-Fi network. Turn your Wi-Fi off. On the Mac, that's in the top right. Windows, it's probably in the lower right. You might have a hardware switch on your laptop. You can truly turn it off. I didn't see any hardwired ports around the room here, so I know none of you are hardwired in. Once you've got your Wi-Fi off, then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to this /offline page and try and load that up. Now, normally this page wouldn't load. Your computer's not connected to the internet. But because of service workers, you just got a page served to you. How is that even possible? When you hit the home page of the site, we pre-cached this page along with all of the HTML files, CSS, JavaScript, external resources, all of that in your local browser cache through the service worker. And so even if you're disconnected from the internet, if you're on the phone, you go into a subway tunnel because you just lost it, you can still continue seeing that information. So let's come back full circle. You can turn your Wi-Fi back on now. Didn't want you to be disconnected for too long. At the beginning, we talked about an e-commerce website and adding products to a shopping cart and improving that experience. And so one of the things that we're working on right now is ways to fix the million people hitting that add to cart button simultaneously, and how can we leverage service workers for that? Going through the checkout process, how can we make sure that we always complete the order and get that order data taken from the user so that we can process it for them and give them a great experience? Using service workers, they don't have to be online for them to finish the checkout process. If they're not online, we can still take all that data, hold on to it in our service worker, give them an order confirmation page that tells them that we've captured their information and we'll be submitting it soon, and they should see an email address confirming their order. Their browser's having trouble connecting right now, so keep your browser open and we'll continue to work to send that, and you'll get that email and know that it came. I could have millions, billions of people place an order simultaneously for all of this, and I can keep my server costs low because I don't need to scale out immensely to be able to handle that load. I just put all of that work and crowdsourced it onto everybody's computer. Similarly, let's say we're going through the checkout process, and for whatever reason, our PHP code has an error. We tried to access something that was undefined. We had a null pointer exception. We've all encountered them some way, somehow, and the user gets back a 500 error, and they can't check out. With service workers, because we can see those network requests going back and forth all the time, we can see that they got a 500 error. And with that, what we can actually do is then take their information and send it to a separate logging endpoint so that a customer service rep can call them and tell them, hey, we know you had problems checking out on our website. We're so sorry about that. We want to make this right to you. Is there anything we can do to help? Would you still like us to continue? And now we just took what was probably a lost sale because nobody could place the order. They kept getting that 500 error. And we made the customer feel spectacular because they had a customer service rep reach out to them to try and make the situation right. As we look forward at all of that and how are we doing it, how do we integrate it with WordPress? I mentioned this was my very first WordPress event here with all of you. And so I thought I would leave all of you with a very special gift. And what we've been working to do is take the service worker code that we've been using with WordPress and actually open source it as a plugin and make it available to all of you. Now, I will warn you, this is still in an early stage of functionality. The e-commerce piece is most definitely not there. There's still some enhancements we want to make to it so that through the WordPress admin panel, you can specify which pages get pre-cached. You can specify what your offline pages are. But this does the very hard part of getting a serviceworker.js file served from the root of your WordPress site without physically copying that JavaScript file to the root of your site. My name is Brian Thompson. I'm on Twitter. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time. I think I still have time for questions. If you don't want to join the group, I will be around for the rest of the night, lingering somewhere in the back, somewhere around the hotel, or tweet at me. I'm more than happy to spend all night chatting about this technology with all of you. Thank you so much.
Anybody have questions for Brian? Couple.
That was the best magic trick ever. That was awesome.
Thank you.
So I'm thinking about use cases for this. This is like a really obvious use case. If you're offline, would you recommend putting something like an About Us page or like all about your company if you can't log? Like, where have you seen this use where you've pre-cached a specific page for online use?
Sure. So
offline use, sorry.
Ignoring the e-commerce aspect and sort of having that offline page, one of the experiences we actually saw just a little bit ago about the disconnected website, using that same functionality, looking for you to be offline so then it can then serve requests to you. I was having a conversation with somebody last night at the party as well who was talking back and forth about news websites, the New York Times, Washington Post, other large news publishers like that, so that users can download certain articles to their phone for reading in the future. I could also see it being used even beyond the offline functionality, tying it in with something like Google Analytics to do some predictive analysis around where do people go after they hit your homepage. Maybe 95% of your traffic hits the page after that, and using that as your pre-cache to sort of improve the experience there. But for the offline pages, we've seen many of them are about us right now. Here's how to contact our customer service reps. Here's a phone number. Here's an email address. Other ways to get in touch.
So this might be a little bit of a dumb question here, but what do we do when suddenly everyone starts using this and you only have a limited amount of space? So now you have every website is trying to preload all of its assets and save them in your cache.
It's a fantastic question, and it's one that hasn't really been answered very well yet. So local browser storage, as the old versions exist of it, is restricted to about 5 megabytes per site. And then it starts to warn the user that you're sucking up quite a bit of bandwidth. There is no defined limit for service workers, although it is a least recently used cache, so it will start to expire data as it needs it. I don't believe Chrome or Firefox have set hard limits for how much you can store. Edge has set the limit at 256 megabytes per site, which is quite a lot of data to be pre-caching for the user. But it's one of those things we're going to have to see. It's actually quite interesting. Google and Facebook have been working to push this forward, and they're actually implementing it before the HTTP spec is officially documented and written as to how it should physically work. They're doing the development in that writing in parallel. So I think as more and more people use it, it's going to be something that they have to figure out.
So you mentioned that you, in one example, that you were loading it from the home page and loading something else. How is that affecting page load speed for the page that it's loading from?
Fantastic question. So the installation of the service worker JavaScript file happens after the first page has loaded, or when that JavaScript file is rendered. You just include your service worker, in my case, sw.js file, as a regular JavaScript file in the HTML you return. I think in my example site, I put it in the header just because that's what was easy as I was doing it. I would normally probably put it in the footer. But because most browsers are now HTTP2, we're using HTTPS with it. We're less restricted on browser number of requests than we were before. And so I haven't seen any noticeable performance degradation from it. I imagine you might if you start to suck down and try and pre-cache a 200 meg QuickTime movie or something, but for small images, HTML files, a couple CSS files, it's been negligible in what I've seen. Other questions?
I think we're out of time. Thank you, Brian.